The set of ideas that is being implemented and advanced in this capital at this time is terribly frightening to people who are students of history.
If you look at the 70 superpowers in history, every single one of them has called themselves exceptional.
And when you look at the Roman Empire, the parallels to what is going on in America are absolutely frightening.
And the question is, are we going to go the right path ourselves, or are we going to continue down the wrong path that so many nations have fallen into?
Everybody's telling me the world's going to hell. Economically, our nation is $15 trillion in debt. Morally, the family is falling apart. Divorce, teenage pregnancy, teenage suicide, drugs, alcohol. You go down to a local high school, and what was once morally unthinkable, that was shameful, is now not only normal, it's celebrated. Spiritually, we used to be proud of our motto as a country, "In God we trust." Now teachers are afraid they're breaking the law if they say that in school. When I look around and I examine the fruit that's hanging on the tree of this country, it's rotting. And when I dig down and examine the root, I find out it's actually worse than I even thought it was. There is something seriously sick in the soul of our country. If you leave a nation long enough, history tells us that eventually there will rise up some kind of a tyrant, some leader who will enslave his people. Why would America be any different? And to top it off, I have friends in church that tell me that the worse things get, the better it really is, because it means that the end is near and that Jesus is returning. Don't worry that the world's going to hell in a handbasket. Just get out of the handbasket. It's part of the plan, that it's meant to be, that the whole thing is gonna burn. Really? Because I have kids in this world. I have friends who have children in this world, and I want a great future for them. And are we supposed to just let it go? But if we just take our hands off the wheel and let it fall off a cliff, aren't we creating a self-fulfilling prophecy? So I turn on the news and find that most people are playing the blame game. The right blames the left blames the right. Government's blaming big business. Business blames big government. Hollywood blames the church and religion. And the church is blaming the media for all of the problems. With everybody blaming everybody else, I'm not hearing a clear voice that's giving us a solution on how to get out of this mess. Wait a minute. It's got to be simpler than this. Maybe it's as simple as we've forgotten what made this nation so successful and healthy and prosperous and secure in the first place. Maybe if we could go back and talk to the men and women who built this country, they would tell us what we're doing wrong and how to fix it. And if anyone understood what it was like to be in a tough spot as a nation, it was them. I mean, our forefathers came out of an era where they were surrounded by darkness on all sides. I mean, this was a time when you could be hung, burned at the stake, beheaded, or drawn and quartered for disagreeing with the queen or the king. The culture was terrible. The nation was bankrupt. The king had tripled the debt. People were slaves. And in their church, they had their antichrists and a king who had set himself up as God on earth in the church. So if anyone knew what it was like to live in difficult times, where it looked like the end was near, it was them. But what was their attitude? It wasn't put your head down and get ready for the end of the world. It was, we're getting off of the defense, getting on the offense, and we see victory in the future. They had a 500-year plan, and they went and built a new nation. Who were these pilgrims? I wanted to learn from them. I wanted to listen to them. And I wanted to find out what made them so unique. So I bought a ticket to England. I went to retrace the escape route of the Pilgrims, our forefathers, to understand who they are, why they did what they did, and how we all got to where we are today. And what I discovered blew my mind and changed everything. My journey began in a sleepy little town called Babworth, England. And I met with this amazing woman who was a local historian and a pilgrim expert named Sue Allen.
Lovely to meet you.
Thank you, you too. I'm Kirk.
It was cold, it was gloomy, kind of wet and overcast, and I felt like I stepped into a different world because I'm sitting on a bench and I've got dead people all around me. I've got the tombs and the tombstones of people that had been there since the year 1200. It was funny because as I was talking with her, it almost felt like she was there. I felt like she knew these people, like they were friends of hers, and she just brought them to life.
When I think of pilgrims, I think of what I was taught in elementary school and history class. We think of pilgrims coming over in these funny black and white suits with big hats and belt buckles on their shoes and turkey guns.
No.
Who were the pilgrims?
Broadly speaking, they were part of the Puritan movement. And to really understand where they're coming from, you need to understand what a Puritan is.
Yes.
Because for the first time, the Bible is printed in English and put into every church. Because until that point, there were Bibles in English being smuggled into the country, and they were deemed to be heretical. You could be burned for having an English Bible.
And what was the fear of having English Bibles in the hands of the people?
What would happen if every Tom, Dick and Harry got to read the Bible for themselves and then started to study it, for goodness sake, and realised that the church in the Bible, as Christ had deemed it should be, was not this church with bishops in palaces, growing rich when the parishioners were starving on the land?
People would then hold them accountable.
Precisely.
And they didn't want that.
And as soon as the Bible was in English, that started to happen.
For the first time, these people got Bibles in English that they could hold and study in their own hands, in their own homes, with their children. This to them was worth more than anything else, even more than their own life, because this was God speaking to them.
And it got to a point that by 1593, there was an act against Puritans brought in. And under that law, it became illegal to be a Puritan. Anybody that disagreed with Elizabeth's new church settlement got this name that you could spit out like a curse: Puritan. The state, the Queen, the monarch, used the clergy as their mouthpiece to control you.
And because of that, you had the government controlling the church and the church controlling the people. And so that's where you have the tyranny and the oppression that you can't get away from.
And the thought is coming to them, if this church can't be purified, maybe we should just separate ourselves away from all this unholiness. That's where the word separatist comes from. And that's the dangerous step, because you're stepping away from the church and you're denouncing the monarch in the same breath.
That's right. You're not just switching denominations, as we would think of switching churches today.
This is tantamount to treason.
By leaving the church.
Yes. They're fighting for their survival from that point, because they are going against the king. It's no matter just they're going against the church and the king is the head of it. It's treason.
So there was my first clue. The separatists were coming out from under the reign of Queen Elizabeth and into the rule of King James. And this guy was a tyrant king on steroids. He's the one who actually invented the phrase, the divine right of kings. He bankrupted his nation, he tripled the debt, and he considered himself to be a devout Christian while he was obsessed with hunting down and destroying the most devout people in his land. One of the things that fascinates me is knowing that once the Bible was translated into English and given to the common man, that changed everything because they started thinking for themselves. They said, this is what the Word of God says. Therefore, church ought to be like what God says it should be, not what the king says. And the king himself is a man who is under authority of the King of Kings. And he too must abide by the law of God.
Once they had come out and shown their true colours, our separatists had no choice but to leave the country or stay and just be slaughtered. And if they were, where was the cause then?
For the Pilgrims to be able to continue to meet and hold their worship services, they had to do it underground. And there was this castle, a manor at a place called Scrooby that was surrounded by a moat for protection. They met this way for 4 years. For 4 years, they had to meet in secret. And by candlelight, they would hold their worship services and their Bible studies. They even had their children as lookouts. And then one by one, they would come back to join their parents, their brothers and sisters, and the rest of their church family to worship God. Every time they opened up a Bible, they had to have been looking over their shoulders, knowing that at any moment the door could burst open and the army comes in and hauls you off to prison, leaving your children and your wife destitute without anything. They knew that it brought them to a place where they had to make a choice. They said, either we're all in and we're going to get caught eventually here, or we're going to make an escape, a strategic retreat out of England where we can continue to grow and develop as a community of faith, and one day come back to England to set our friends, family, the church, and the entire nation free from this tyrant. The Pilgrims made a secret negotiation with a Dutch sea captain who was to come and pick them up on the shores of England in the middle of the night in his boat and secretly take them across the water to Holland.
Our separatists have been walking from Scrooby 60 miles overland. It's September, it's cold. They're camping out, no tents, no sleeping bags. They're not even lighting a fire because the searchers might already be looking for them. Windy, cold, probably wet, when they suddenly see out this very flat landscape, a ship looming out. This ship that's going to take them to freedom.
Unfortunately, the sea captain was also double-dealing. He had made another agreement with the local authorities to capture the separatists and hand them over to them. And the deal was, if he would give them the Pilgrims, the captain could keep all of their money. Well, the Pilgrims had already sold everything that they had up until that point. They had no job, they sold their houses, they sold their lands, no money. Anything that they had left, some of the women had these things hiding under their dresses. So the army comes and captures them, strips them down, takes everything that they have, and throws them into jail.
Yeah, this was a huge failure. They had this great plan. Now we're going to get on a boat and go to a new land, but we get caught. Our Bibles are taken away from us. We're thrown into prison, puts our wives and kids in jeopardy, but they don't stop. They don't see that as a closed door. They see that as just one of the, they see those as battle wounds and scars and lessons that God is teaching them to prepare them for the next mission. What is the rocket fuel that pushes them to say failure is not final? They're not going, man, this stinks. They're saying, what's next? And they plan their next escape. Not out of fear, but with excitement and passion and enthusiasm, because they know that God has commissioned them and sent them on an assignment. They planned their next escape, and this time it was potentially even more dangerous. The first time they went together on this boat, but the men knew that they were now being watched. So the husbands separated themselves from their wives and children. They hired another sea captain to meet them in the river, to take them to Holland, but they sent their wives and children on ahead by putting them on a little raft and floating them down a stream in hopes of meeting them as they came out of the woods in the middle of the night to link back up at the boat, knowing that they may never see them again in this lifetime. I mean, that blows my mind to think of saying to my wife, Chelsea, you're gonna be fine. God's gonna work this together for our good. James, Jack, Luke, guys, if I don't see you again in this life, you remember everything I taught you. You take care of your mom, you take care of your sisters. These guys were all in.
The problem was the women got here a day early and consequently were very seasick. So they came into the shore where it was, you know, less movement. And the problem was they got caught right there on a mud bank. Horrors of horrors. Armed men closing in on the women. The women are helpless. They can't get out of the craft. It's stuck on the mud. They're sitting ducks. The men can't do anything. The women have got all the belongings, all the money. And the captain, when he sees the position, now this was dangerous because if he was caught, they'd take his ship from him. That's his living. So he cries an oath, Sacramente, and he goes. And once that Dutch ship hit the North Sea, the mother of all storms blew up. And the men were just carried off towards Norway. 2 weeks that storm blew. 2 weeks. They couldn't control the ship, so they just put themselves below deck and they just had to let it ride out the storm. It must have been terrifying. Bradford said, you know, for days on end, they didn't see the sun, the moon, the sky, and they really thought they were going to die. And at one point, when they really thought the end was near, our separatists prayed in earnest. They prayed and they said, even now, Lord, even now, you could save us. And the storm abated. They got control of the ship and turned about and made their way to Holland, to Amsterdam, because in that same storm, there were hundreds and hundreds of vessels lost. This one survived to tell the tale. How miraculous is that? Amazing.
The story is getting amazing. I mean, here's 100 ships get caught up in this storm and don't make it, but the ship with the pilgrims on it makes it to Holland. They don't have their wives and their kids. They're hoping that they'll meet up with them again. It's not till a year later I learned that they actually got their wives and kids over to Holland with them. I couldn't get on a plane and go back to America now. I had to follow this trail. I bought a ticket and got on a ferry and took it across the channel to Holland so that I could see where they set up shop in Leiden. and began their church service there under the leadership of their pastor, John Robinson.
And the storm abated. This one survived to tell the tale. How miraculous is that?
Yeah, this is not the story that I heard growing up in school. Quiet little religious fuddy-duddies scurry out of England with their tail between their legs and come to America not knowing how to plant corn or fend for themselves. No, they actually planned to go somewhere where they could find spiritual freedom so that